So we're going to be looking at section 8.3 in this last part of the lecture, and this part is going to look more closely at the reactions that occur within photosynthesis. So first of all, starting with the anatomy, where is photosynthesis exactly occurring? So we're going to start from the outside of the plant. If you're looking at a leaf, and then you zoom into the leaf and look at an individual plant cell, that's where you find chloroplasts. So now next we'll zoom into the chloroplast and see what's inside of it. So within a chloroplast we have two major structures or portions. The first is the thylakoid. And so thylakoids, an individual or single thylakoid, looks like a pancake. And then when we have a stack of these, they're called granum. And thylakoids are like empty sacs. They actually have an empty space within them. And this is where our light-dependent reactions are going to be occurring. So these stacks of thylakoid that again are called granum, that's where we have our light-dependent reactions occurring. So here's a picture showing the granum is that stack. And then within the thylakoid, we have photosystems. So now, again, I said the light-dependent reactions are occurring in the thylakoid, and it's actually within the thylakoid's membrane. So each of these little sacs, these thylakoids, actually have a lipid bilayer membrane, just like the cell membrane. And within that membrane are a series of proteins that actually make up what we call an electron transport chain. And within that, one of those proteins, actually two of them, are specifically called photosystems. And those photosystems are what have actually antennae to receive the sunlight. And so to take that sunlight's energy and begin the process of converting it into chemical energy. So if, again, we're looking inside a chloroplast, we have the basic structure here of the thylakoid. And the thylakoid is, again, where we have our light-dependent reaction occurring. So this is the first step in photosynthesis. So we have light coming into the photosystems that are located in the membrane of the thylakoid. Then we have water also coming into the plant cell. And the light-dependent reactions are going to use that water and use the light in order to convert NADP to NADPH and to make ATP out of ADP. The other product that we get from the light-dependent reactions is oxygen. So now the purpose of the NADPH and the ATP is to provide energy in order for the next part of photosynthesis to occur. And so the next part is called the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle also needs CO2. So CO2, again, if you remember back from our last lecture, enters through the leaf, through the stomata of the leaf, which are the little holes on the bottom of a leaf. And they enter into what is called this area here. This area that is surrounding the thylakoid granum is called the stroma, S-T-R-O-M-A. And the stroma is where the Calvin cycle is occurring. So the NADPH and the ATP take the energy that is been converted from the light by the photosystems here in the thylakoids, and it takes the energy over to the Calvin cycle so that the Calvin cycle can make sugar. And while that's happening, the energy gets taken from these, the NADPH gets converted back to NADP+, and the ATP is converted back to ADP. So we go from that triphosphate down to the diphosphate. The NADP molecules are what we call electron carriers. So when the electrons in chlorophyll absorb the sunlight, those electrons get a lot of energy. And so cells use electron carriers to transport these high energy electrons from the thylakoid to the stroma. And one of those carrier molecules is NADP+. NADP+ accepts and holds actually two high energy electrons. And it also takes along with it a hydrogen ion or hydrogen proton, this H+, which is how we get NADP+. See, the plus means it's missing an electron. So if we add two electrons here, we end up with NADP. We no longer have the plus because we have an electron. And then the hydrogen proton is also missing an electron, so the second electron is added onto this hydrogen. So now this NADPH electron carrier is going to carry two electrons to the Calvin cycle. So this is one way that sunlight energy can be trapped in a chemical form. So if you look at, again, this is a little more detailed than you actually even need to know. But in the light reactions, we have these photosystems that are getting light energy, and they're taking electrons from water, and they're sending them along electron transport chain. And this is a second photosystem, which also takes light energy, and it is going to take those electrons and make them have more energy again, and then they're passed on to NADP+, and we end up with NADPH. And you can think of NADPH as kind of the taxi that's driving these electrons that started over here to the Calvin cycle out in the stroma. And the reason that we need energy in the Calvin cycle, you can see here we're using some of the ATP that we made, and we're using the NADPH. It's because we're building a molecule. So we're taking carbon dioxide, and we're taking the carbons away from it, and we're building them into a carbohydrate. And so what we end up with through the Calvin cycle is we take 3 carbon dioxides and we end up with 3 carbon sugars. So if you think of like glucose, for example, that's C6H12O6, glucose is a 6 carbon sugar. So from the Calvin cycle, we actually end up with just a 3 carbon sugar. So we actually need the Calvin cycle to go around enough times that we get 2 of these 3 carbon sugars, so that then we can build a glucose molecule. So this is going to show the electron transport chain again. So again, this is the light-dependent reactions. So this is the thylakoid membrane that you see here. And the circles, the green and blue and red, are all proteins that are embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid. So the photosynthesis begins when the pigments in photosystem 2, which is this first green circle right here, when that absorbs light, the electrons are going to gain more energy. So you can see the energy being added here. The high energy electrons then are passed down this electron transport chain, so they're going to be passed down to each of the different proteins here until they reach the next photosystem, which is the second green. This is the second green photosystem here. Because as they're being passed down, the electrons actually start losing the energy that they gained in the first photosystem. So they get like a booster charge at the second photosystem. So again, the reason we need water in the light-dependent reactions is for to get their electrons, actually. So there's enzymes in the thylakoid membrane that are going to break water molecules into hydrogen ions and oxygen atoms. And so this is where we get oxygen from photosynthesis. And then, of course, the water is giving up its electrons. The energized electrons from water replace the high-energy electrons that the chlorophyll lost to the electron transport chain. So as this photosystem, the chlorophyll in here took in the light energy, and so it's going to pass electrons along here, but it's missing electrons now, so it takes them from the water. And as plants remove electrons from water, oxygen is left behind and released into the air. And then the hydrogen ions that are left behind when water is broken apart are just left inside the thylakoid membrane. Also, as the electrons are being passed along from protein to protein along this electron transport chain, there are more hydrogen ions that pass into the thylakoid. So if you think of this green section in here, this is inside the thylakoid sac. So you think of that sac again that we were looking at, and this is a close-up view of it. And surrounding the thylakoid is the stroma. So in the stroma, we have some hydrogen protons floating around. And as these electrons are passing down the chain, these hydrogen protons actually are able to pass through the proteins into the thylakoid. So we start to get a buildup of hydrogen ions within the thylakoid space. So inside the sac of the thylakoid, we start to find a lot of hydrogens. Okay, and so again, the electron is going from photosystem 2, which is backwards, but it was the first one discovered, to photosystem 1. And the pigments in photosystem 1 use energy from the sunlight again to give those electrons a boost of energy. So now they're ready to get picked up by the NADP+, and then some more hydrogen ions are added to the NADP+ to make NADPH. So as electrons are passed from the chlorophyll to NADPH, and I'm going to say from the electron transport chain to NADPH, more hydrogen ions are pumped across the membrane. So again, remember I said we have this building up here of hydrogen protons. And so after a while, the inside of the thylakoid here is filled up with a very high positive charge of hydrogen ions, because these are all H pluses. So we start to end up with a lot of positive electrical charge within the thylakoid here. So that means we are beginning to have a concentration gradient. So thinking back to what we learned about diffusion, whenever we have a high concentration of something, it wants to diffuse back to where it has a low concentration. And so, but in order for that, because these do have a charge, they cannot pass through the lipid bilayer membrane. So just like in the cell membrane, things that have a charge don't pass through membranes. So they need facilitated diffusion. They need a protein channel to pass back through. And so the way that this works with this electron transport chain is that we have a protein that's called ATP synthase. And if you think of anything that ends with ACE is an enzyme, this protein is an enzyme that is actually going to convert ADP into ATP. So you can see, again, our high concentrations inside the thylakoid membrane. This is outside in the stroma. Our ATP synthase is going